Okay, so please join me in welcoming him to the stage. That's when you clap. Come on, bring him up.
Thank you. Hi. So I've been working on this internet policy and regulation stuff since like 2002, when the big issue was whether Napster should be liable for the things its users did. And back then, I struggled to convey to skeptics that the outcome of the Napster fight was about more than music. It was about whether the network would someday grow to be a planetary scale nervous system for our species, or would be regulated like it was a troublesome jukebox. But then as the years went by, something changed. People woke up to the fact that the internet was not just a glorified video on demand service or a tool for recruiting jihadi fighters. They saw that the internet was a tool that had become essential to our family lives, to our romance lives, to our education, to our employment, to our political and civic engagement, to our play, and to our business. That doesn't mean that we can't hope to regulate it wisely, but it does mean that we need to regulate it carefully, with gravitas, and a sense that a misstep could have unintended consequences that rippled out in many unexpected domains. And I started to hold out hope that we would begin to reverse some of our earlier, stupider mistakes back when we thought that the internet might just be a better pornography distribution system. Like the Digital Millennium Copyright Act in the US, which was then implemented in law here through Bill C-35 under the Tories, shepherded in by James Moore and Tony Clement. So these are rules that ban circumventing any kind of copyright protection system. Now, they were originally designed to add weight, legal weight, to otherwise very flimsy technical measures like region coding on DVD players. After all, it's not a copyright infringement to go to another country and buy a DVD and then go home and watch it. That's like the literal opposite of a copyright infringement. That's what you're supposed to do under copyright. You go and you buy a creative work at the price the rights holder has set, and then you enjoy it in the customary way. And so if they were going to enforce something like region coding and stop manufacturers from making kits to de-regionalize your DVD players, they would need some legal measures to prevent you from doing this. And that's where we get the Digital Millennium Copyright Act and its sister laws around the world. Laws that ban breaking copyright systems, copyright protection systems, even when you're not doing so to enable a copyright infringement. And that sounds like a nuisance when we're talking about DVD players, but as time went on, software, the copyrighted work, started to infiltrate every category of device. And we started to see these anti-circumvention rules covering on an expanding constellation of device types, from implanted defibrillators to cars to thermostats to coffee makers to tractors to voting machines. Now, these laws were an attractive nuisance. They promised manufacturers that they needed only to configure their devices in such a way so that the law would bind their customers to conduct their affairs to benefit the manufacturer's shareholders, even when it ran contrary to the user's own interests. That they could force you to buy ink from them at a price that exceeded that of vintage Veuve Clicquot, or only get your car or your phone serviced from an authorized service center that could decide how much to charge you, and whether your device was repairable at all, or whether it needed to be thrown away and replaced so that they could generate another sale. So manufacturers, when they woke up to the fact that they had copyrighted works in their devices and they could use anti-circumvention law to control their users' conduct, they basically bootstrapped this into a new doctrine that's become something like a felony contempt of business model statute. And worse still, from the perspective of people here, is that these laws also chill security researchers. Because if in order to do a pen test or report and disclose a vulnerability and release proof of concept code, you have to go past one of these copyright laws, you commit a potential felony. And in the US, that felony carries a 5-year prison sentence and a $500,000 fine for a first offense. And what this has the effect of is turning every device into a reservoir of long-lived digital pathogens that good guys know about but can't report, and bad guys know about and can exploit at will. As the years went by and more people got online, our network policy started to touch more corners of our lives. The absurdity of using copyright law, a regulation intended to set the parameters for the entertainment industry, to regulate this universal network, became more absurd to more people. And it seemed like we were ready for a change, and I began to hold out hope. But then the last year happened. It has been an anno horribilis for technology policy. It has been a nightmare assault, a blitzkrieg of terrible network policies swiftly ushered into law with little or no public debate and in the very worst of bad faith. From the Australian rules banning working cryptography, to the American attack on online discussions of sex and sexuality, to the European mandate for copyright filters for all media types, video, audio, text, and other communications, to the post-Christchurch shooting global initiatives requiring online platforms to remove terrorist and other illegal content without any chance for human review, passed or pending now in Australia, the EU, and in the UK. We are living through a real-time, high-speed Chinification of the Western internet, where our networks are being subject to surveillance and control that has not been dreamt of since the age in which every country had one state-owned phone company that knew everything everyone was doing. But unlike those days, the phones are in our pockets, and they're always on, and they're in possession of every intimate secret of our lives. And unlike those days, authoritarians don't need to hire an army of snoops to listen in on us. The algorithms can do the work for them. And I want to take a moment now just to review what's happened in the last year, because the news comes at you fast, and the torrent of bad news has been roaring past us. Let's start with the ban on working crypto. Since the late 1980s, spies and cops have been warning that everyday people should not have access to working cryptography. Until 1992, the US National Security Agency treated crypto as a munition and imposed criminal penalties for anyone trafficking in scrambling systems stronger than a very weak cipher called DES-50, which the NSA said was too strong for criminals to break, but weak enough for the police to break if they needed to. Now, in 1992, the nonprofit I worked for, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, represented a UC Berkeley grad student named Daniel J. Bernstein, who is today an eminent cryptographer. And we sued the US government on his behalf. Now, Bernstein had been publishing strong ciphers on Usenet, an early messaging system that was a precursor to the World Wide Web's own message boards. And we argued that the American First Amendment that protects free speech protected his right to publish source code. That source code was a form of expressive speech under the US Constitution. And we won that suit in the Ninth Circuit. We won it again in the appellate division. The NSA decided not to try their luck at the Supreme Court, and this is why we have access to strong cryptography today. And today, every one of us uses strong crypto all day long. Our devices encrypt everything we save on them, so that if we lose them, other people won't be able to access that data. And our networks automatically encrypt everything we send over them, using crypto to limit who can access our Wi-Fi networks, to secure our Bluetooth communications, and to protect our data as it traverses the public internet. When your computer or your printer or your pacemaker or your automobile receives an operating system update, this is encrypted to prevent tampering, and cryptographic signatures are used to validate the authenticity of the update to prevent malicious actors from compromising your systems by pushing bad software to them, disguised as a manufacturer's update. Crypto protects the integrity of your data, of your communications, and of your devices. It's what stands between you and identity theft, and between you and someone murdering you by compromising your car's operating system, or maybe the operating system of your pacemaker. And modern cryptography is really strong. Barring advances in quantum cryptography, properly implemented crypto can protect your secrets forever, by which I mean if we convert all the hydrogen atoms in the universe into computers and set them to doing nothing but guessing what your key is, we run out of universe before we run out of possible keys. And that is great news when it comes to protecting your data and your person from malicious attacks. But authoritarians have never given up on the project of banning working crypto, citing those four horsemen of the information apocalypse: pedophiles, terrorists, criminals, and drug dealers as people who benefit from being able to keep secrets from the authorities. And they insist, despite all evidence, that it is possible to design an encryption system that will protect you from bad guys, but will not protect bad guys from them. And when the former Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull was told that the laws of mathematics said that we don't know how to make crypto that's so strong that bad guys can't break it, but so weak that good guys can, he said literally the dumbest thing anyone has ever said about technology policy. He said that the laws of mathematics are very commendable, but I assure you that in Australia, the laws of Australia are the laws of Australia. Now you laugh, but a year later, the Australian Parliament banned working cryptography and passed a mandate that says the Australian government can go to any manufacturer of a strong cryptographic system and insist that they deliberately weaken it by introducing defects and pushing those out to their users so that Australian authorities can break working crypto. So that's the first horseman of the apocalypse and the first problems that we've had with technology policy, this deliberate weakening of our internet security. But now let's talk about sex. The world's democracies integrated the internet into their legal systems with something called safe harbors. These safe harbors, they say that you can provide a platform for user speech and communication, and you don't have to spy on everything your users say and do in order to prevent them from saying bad speech. Under safe harbor, you aren't liable for your users' bad speech, for their copyright infringement, for their obscenity, for their planning or facilitating of criminal acts. And in return, everyone who uses the internet gets a streamlined system to remove things from the safe harbor. If you're a rights holder whose copyright is infringed, you can just send a letter to an online service provider and say, this work infringes my copyright, and they take it down. You don't have to go to court. You don't have to show evidence. You know, when I worked in a science fiction bookstore in Toronto, if you thought that one of the books on our shelves infringed your copyright, you didn't get to just walk into the bookstore, point at the minimum wage clerk behind the counter and say, I insist that you remove that, and expect that the book would come down. But on the internet, you can literally send an email to a minimum wage employee in a data center or customer service center overseas, and they will facilitate the removal of materials just on your say-so. So Safe Harbor allows for users to speak, and it allows for people who are aggrieved by those users to remove that speech. Now, in the US, safe harbors never extended to protecting online service providers from knowingly facilitating in sex trafficking. Those sites could still be held criminally and they knew that their users were engaged in sex trafficking. But despite this, in 2018, the US Congress passed a law called FOSTA-SESTA, depending on whether it's the Senate or the Congress, that was supposed to prevent sex trafficking. And under this new law, platforms are liable for sex trafficking engaged in by their users, even if they don't know about it. In other words, platforms have gained a duty to police all sex-related conversations and discover whether anyone in those discussions is the victim of non-consensual sex acts or is being set up for non-consensual sex acts. Now, this is a duty that's very onerous, and it's so onerous that after this passed, virtually every service in the US in which sex-related services are discussed or sold was immediately shut down. Services just couldn't take the chance that one in the thousands or millions of discussions taking place involves sex trafficking. And so a year later, rather than people being made safer, sex workers are now reporting that they faced much more violence because among the services that got shut down in that great dragnet were the services that sex workers used to discuss which clients were unsafe and traded tips to keep themselves safer, which is why pimping has made a giant comeback in the United States, because when we move sex activities from private apartments where clients are vetted using online services to streetwalkers, they need physical security in the real world. So sex has become this go-to excuse for attacking our privacy, our anonymity, and our speech. So in the UK, starting this July, every service that allows access to erotica or pornography will have to register with an age verification service before allowing users access to adult content. And any UK-based adult site that doesn't comply with this will face criminal and civil sanctions, while offshore sites that fail to comply with this will be blocked at the border thanks to the British Great Firewall, the National Firewall. And these age checks will require a credit card, which means that when these databases leak, and it's a matter of when, not if, attackers will have access to a list of the kinks and sexual fantasies of every British consumer of pornography linked to their financial data, making it easy to sort potential blackmail victims according to their net worth, right? And then there's Tumblr. Oh, Tumblr. Tumblr was once a haven for sexual expression, including notably women's sexual expression, which is very absent from mainstream pornographic sites, as well as sexual expression by people from sexual minorities, LGBTQ sexual minorities. Now in 2018, after SESTA-FOSTA passed, Apple kicked Tumblr out of the App Store because they couldn't take the risk that they would be held liable under Sesta Fosta. And Tumblr responded by instituting a ban on all adult content, but because there is no boiler room big enough to fill it with prudes to look at everything every Tumblr user posts and delete it from the service, they built an automated machine learning algorithm that could supposedly detect porn and remove it. But filters, they're crude instruments. These are all my own Tumblr posts that have been blocked. You'll note that among the posts that have been blocked, there on the far left, is a post showing the images that Tumblr said wouldn't be blocked using its filter. This is Tumblr's own example of the kind of thing that isn't going to be blocked by its nudity filter. This has been blocked by their nudity filter. So speaking of filters, last month, the European Union took the most drastic step to censor and centralize the internet in the history of the free world. The European Parliament passed a new copyright directive, and included in that was a very controversial component of it called Article 13. This was so controversial that it attracted 5 million signatures on a petition opposing it. It was the largest petition in European history and the second largest in world history after the petition against SOPA, the earlier US copyright directive. Now, Article 13 is a rule that obliterates the safe harbor for copyright. It makes platforms liable if their users post things that infringe copyright, even if they don't know about it. And like SESTA, this rule applies in a way that creates a duty for the platforms to examine everything that their users post to ensure that it doesn't infringe copyright. And of course, that's going to mean filters. YouTube alone, they get 400 hours of video every minute. There's no way for them to screen that without using automated systems. Now, this didn't stop Article 13's boosters from insisting that filters would not be required by the rule. They said, well, look, the legal language in the rule, it doesn't say to use a filter. In fact, it says if you can figure out how to examine all of the stuff that your users post without filters, you should avoid filters if at all possible. But there's no way that human beings are going to be able to examine every tweet, every Facebook update, every Tinder profile photo, every source code fragment posted to Quora, and determine whether or not it infringes copyright. So whether or not the directive said it was going to need filters, it was always going to need filters. Look, if I say I require as a matter of law that you produce a large gray African land mammal with tusks and a trunk and 4 legs, but if at all possible don't make it an elephant, I'm still going to get an elephant. And indeed, in the few weeks since the directive passed, and I'm not making this up, the directive passed by 5 votes, and afterwards it turned out that 10 of the MEPs had fat-fingered the wrong button. In the weeks since the directive passed, the European Commissioner, who is the biggest proponent of this, as well as the governments of Germany and France, have said this will absolutely require filters, which means that everything we post to a European service provider is going to be compared to a database of copyrighted works and blocked if it seems like a match. Now, I called it a database of copyrighted works, but it would be much more accurate to call this a database of works that someone somewhere said was copyrighted. Because under the system, anyone can claim copyright to anything just by uploading it to the database. You could put the whole works of Shakespeare in. You could put the alphabet in. You could put Happy Birthday in there, or a video of a cop hitting a protester, or a picture of a company's effluent pipe dumping pollutants into the water supply. And then no one else could be able to post it. Once it's in the database, it would be blocked across all these service providers. And the directive and its authors explicitly rejected any penalties for falsely claiming copyright over something that doesn't belong to you, even in cases of malicious attempts to censor information, or even in attempts to steal an artist's income by falsely claiming their work as your own. But there's more, because just after the directive passed, a white supremacist in Christchurch murdered 50 people at 2 mosques and live-streamed a grotesque terrorist attack. And in the aftermath of that attack, countries around the world are eroding safe harbor even further than the copyright directive does. They're adopting rules that require platforms to remove offensive, violent, or terroristic content in 1 hour or less. That rule has already passed in Australia. It has advanced in the European Union, and the UK Parliament just accepted a paper from its regulator with similar language. And in case you're thinking that this sounds reasonable, because after all, nobody wants that stuff to be live streamed, consider this. Right after the rule advanced to the European Parliament, the French National Anti-Terror Police submitted a terrorism takedown to the Internet Archive, proprietors of the Wayback Machine. And this terrorism takedown, which they gave the archive 24 hours to comply with, and which came through at 4 in the morning on the West Coast where they're all located, listed the entire Project Gutenberg archive, 15 million text files, and the collected works of the Grateful Dead. And they said, somewhere in there is some terrorist stuff. You can figure out what it is and remove it, or you can just remove all of it. We're not going to tell you what we had in mind. Now, this order, under the terrorism regulation, would have the force of law, even though it doesn't require judicial review, even though it is facially absurd. So the European Terrorism Directive, Anti-Terror Directive, it doesn't mandate filters. Those were removed at the last minute, but there's no way that you can respond to a takedown for 15 million works in 1 hour without filters, any more than you could identify and remove all the copyright infringement or human trafficking or any other kind of bad content at scale. Almost overnight, in less than a year, we have gone from an internet where speech carries the presumption of innocence, where you could post anything and it would be live until it attracted a credible complaint, to an internet where increasingly all of our speech of every kind is being judged by a set of unaccountable black box AI algorithms and automatically censored if it seems to fall into nebulous, impossible to pin down categories like extremism or nudity or copyright infringement. And this happened on our watch. This happened while we were all around watching it happen. In large part, it happened because we hate the platforms. Nobody likes living in a 21st century where our internet has been replaced with these 5 giant surveillance-riddled websites where people only post screenshots from the other 4. But ironically, our well-founded desire to punish these giant platforms only gives them more power. Think of filters. Google spent $100 million developing the copyright filter for YouTube, Content ID. And during the European copyright debate, YouTube's CEO went out and said, actually, we kind of like filters. Because while Google would prefer to have no regulation, they can live with regulation that only Google can afford to comply with, and that none of its competitors can possibly hope to comply with. There aren't any European startups with $100 million kicking around to build a Content ID when the rule kicks in. And so at the stroke of a pen, the European Union has wiped out its entire tech sector, signed its death warrant, leaving the field open for the handful of mostly US-based giant tech companies who can't afford filters. And the British porn blockade, it's going to be administered by a Canadian company called MindGeek. You've probably never heard of MindGeek, but I'm sure you've heard of the sites that they own: PornTube, Pornhub, RedTube, YouPorn, Browsers, Digital Playground, Men.com, Reality Kings, and Sean Cody. A company that grew through the underhanded tactic of destroying the revenues of for-pay rivals with clips uploaded to their free sites and then buying those rivals at fire sale prices will now be in charge of the destiny of every competitor that it hasn't yet destroyed. Is it any wonder that Mark Zuckerberg went to Congress 2 weeks ago and called for government to regulate his company? Because with Facebook at the table when those regulations are negotiated, all the regulations will be guaranteed to be ones that Facebook can live with, but they will certainly be onerous enough to destroy any competitor that might someday grow to challenge Facebook. How do we get here? How is it that the tech sector is so incredibly concentrated? Well, for one thing, it's not just the tech sector. Every industry has experienced radical concentration. There are only 4 movie studios left. It was 5 until 3 weeks ago when Disney and Fox consummated their acquisition. There are 4 record labels left. There's still 5 publishers for now, but it's going to be 4 if the rumors about Simon & Schuster being sold to HarperCollins turn out to be true. And not just books and publishing, your glasses. One company, an Italian company called Luxottica, they manufacture Armani, Brooks Brothers, Burberry, Chanel, Coach, DKNY, Dolce & Gabbana, Michael Kors, Oakley, Oliver Peoples, Persil, Polo Ralph Lauren, Ray-Ban, Tiffany, Valentino, Vogue, and Versace. They own retailers like Pearl Vision, Sears Optical, Sunglass Hut, and Target Optical, as well as Lens Crafters, and insurers like iMed Vision Care and Essilor, the largest lab manufacturing prescription lenses and contact lenses in the world. Right? So every time you buy glasses, you buy them from one company. It's not just glasses, it's not just entertainment, it's not just tech, it's wrestling. There's one wrestling league left, the WWE, worth $3.5 billion. And of course, being the only game in town, it can class its wrestlers as contractors and deny them health care. So they're dropping like flies, dying in their 40s and 50s. When you ask tech sector investors how tech got so big, they have lots of answers. They'll tell you that it's because of first mover advantage or because of network effects, but none of that explains how wrestling got so concentrated. And besides, if network effects and first mover advantages are so important, then why aren't we searching Alta Vista with our craze? To understand how everything got so concentrated, we need to go back in time to a very special year, 1979. That's the year the first commercially successful personal computer came to market. It's the year that this guy launched his presidential campaign. So Ronald Reagan came to power amidst a wave of deregulatory sentiment. Margaret Thatcher in the UK, Brian Mulroney here in Canada, Helmut Kohl in Germany, Augusto Pinochet in Chile. And they took power at a moment in which the relatively even wealth distribution that we'd had after World War II, when all of the wealth in the world had been destroyed, had concentrated into a small enough number of hands that they could start paying for political influence to make policies that made the rich even richer. And Reagan was a great fan of policies that made rich people richer. In particular, he subscribed to a bizarre ahistorical theory of antitrust law. Reagan thought that antitrust law's purpose was not to prevent monopolies, but to prevent consumer harm, by which he meant prices going up. And his theory of antitrust, which is now the dominant theory of antitrust around the world, was that monopolies were fine so long as they didn't raise prices for consumers. They could do everything else, but not that. In living memory, companies were not allowed to be vertically integrated, right? If you ran a railroad company, you couldn't also own the companies that shipped the freight. You could either own the thing in the rail car, or you could own the rail car, but not both. And companies weren't allowed to grow by merging with their biggest rivals or snapping up and crushing their nascent competitors. Today, we're asked to believe that something has changed in our technology that makes monopolies inevitable. But every single one of these monopolists grew by doing things that we used to prevent in the name of preventing monopolies. Look at a company like Google. Apart from search and Gmail, every notable product Google makes is a company that it made by buying a company that it would have been barred from buying before Ronald Reagan came to power. Or think about Facebook. Facebook tells advertisers that it spies on us so much so that it can tell exactly what we're going to do, and that it can use machine learning to convince us of anything an advertiser wants us to believe. Facebook claims that it can use machine learning and surveillance to build a mind control ray. But what Facebook really has is not a mind control ray. It's really detailed dossiers, non-consensually compiled on 2.3 billion users. And it can use those profiles to target those users. If you're trying to locate someone who has a really hard to find trait, like someone thinking of buying a refrigerator, Facebook can offer you ads targeted to recent home buyers, or people who have priced out kitchen renovations, or people who search for fridge reviews, and it can cross-reference them with their net worth and their creditworthiness. Now that's creepy and gross, but it's not mind control. It's just a high surveillance version of selling ice water on a hot day, or giving out coupons for free diapers to people leaving a maternity ward. Now, it benefits Facebook to claim that they've got a mind control ray. You know, you get companies like Cambridge Analytica who make millions off that idea. They tell us that they can find reasonable people and turn them into Trump voters or get them to vote for Brexit. But isn't it more likely that they found racists and xenophobes and convinced them that Trump and Brexit were good ideas? We know that every public claim that Facebook makes is a self-serving lie. Don't take my word for it. That's what the Attorney General of New Zealand just said about them. So if we're going to disbelieve everything Facebook says, why would we believe their sales literature? Users don't like Facebook, but they can't escape it. 15 million American users aged 13 to 35 left Facebook last year, but most of them landed on Instagram, which is a Facebook subsidiary that Facebook never would have been allowed to buy if we were still enforcing antitrust law. Indeed, the whole Instagram story is an important lesson in the role that monopoly plays in creating surveillance and other inequities. Few of us remember that for the first 10 years of Facebook's existence, they billed themselves as a pro-privacy alternative to rivals like Orkut and MySpace. In fact, they said the reason that they had a walled garden was to stop these surveillance-happy rivals from harvesting your profile and using it to target from you. And it promised that it would never target you. But each time one of those competitors went under, that promise got a little weaker, and Facebook's surveillance and targeting got a little more aggressive. And as it grew in monopoly power and became the only game in town, every web publisher on the web added a like button, because without it they wouldn't get traffic. And now Facebook could spy on every web page on the internet, because every one of those like buttons was beaconing user data back to Facebook. Facebook's dominance was near total, but the market was lucrative enough that some people kept trying to break into it. And there's only one that really made a go of it. It's called Snapchat. And what's Snapchat's value proposition? We're like Facebook, but we're private. We delete your conversations. And it worked. People flocked to Snapchat because they wanted privacy, and the market wasn't delivering it. So what did Facebook do? Well, they acquired another company called Onavo that made spyware designed as a battery monitor. And Onavo was used to spy on Facebook users who were also using Snapchat. It gave them the market intelligence they needed to buy Instagram, and also to tune Instagram's features after the acquisition based on the surveillance data they gathered using Onavo from Snapchat users. So everything about this story would have been illegal under traditional antitrust law. They wouldn't have been allowed to buy Instagram. They wouldn't have been allowed to renege on their promises. They wouldn't have been allowed to corner the market on and force advertisers to add like buttons. They wouldn't have been able to use Onavo to spy on their customers. And so today, despite a market hungry for privacy, we have no privacy-oriented social networks. Facebook owns all the users who might join those networks, and they won't let them out. You know, when Facebook started, the majority of potential Facebook users were on MySpace. And Facebook's biggest problem with luring users from Facebook into MySpace was that everyone you wanted to talk to was still on MySpace. And so Facebook made a MySpace robot. You gave it your login credentials, it would log into MySpace, pull down the messages waiting for you, and bring them into your Facebook inbox. And you could reply to them there, and it would send them back to MySpace and say, sent from Facebook, why are you still using MySpace? But within a few years, when a competitor did this to Facebook, Facebook was able to muster a crack legal team that advanced a radical theory of the US Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, another law that dates back to Ronald Reagan, passed in haste after Reagan saw the movie War Games and was terrified that America needed tougher anti-hacking statutes. And they used it to destroy the competitor Power Ventures that did that. And today, Snapchat is limping along because most of the people who want to use Snapchat can't, because the people they want to use it with are over there on Facebook. So to recap, we're on Facebook because our friends are there. Facebook's dominance lets them coerce web publishers into installing surveillance beacons on most of the web pages. Facebook is valuable only because they have dossiers that they can use to target us for ads. Facebook's only competitor is a pro-privacy alternative, which Facebook is crushing with antitrust tactics that, although radioactively illegal, have not been enforced against for a generation. Even though people are leaving Facebook in droves, they're ending up on other Facebook properties because Facebook is the only game in town. Now, apologists say that this is because tech is different. But I don't know about you, but it sure sounds to me like it might be worth giving the old anti-monopoly stuff a try at this point. For one thing, if there wasn't one big Facebook, then the decision that Facebook's engineers make wouldn't be so consequential. It wouldn't be the one place where streaming your white nationalist terror attack could reach a potential audience of 2.3 billion people. But of course, some people say that Facebook isn't just the place where people go to stream those atrocities. They say that they're where the people who commit those atrocities are recruited, how we manufacture those terrorists. And there is some truth to that. Between the engagement algorithms that increase page views and ad revenues by showing users controversial material, and the ability to target users who are receptive to conspiracy theories and racially motivated hate speech, the platforms have made it easier than ever to recruit people to the cause of genocide. But if Facebook is a people-finding system and not a mind control ray, it's worth asking why there are so many people out there who are receptive to messages about the desirability of genocide and other conspiracies, from anti-vax to the flat earth. And for that, I think we also have to look to the time of Reagan. We have had 40 years of make the rich richer policies, and now the richest among us are much richer, and everyone else is much poorer. And the result is that our institutions no longer operate as honest brokers on the basis of evidence. Rather, they increasingly operate to enrich the highest bidder. Whether that's the link between cancer and tobacco, or emissions and climate control, or opioids and addiction, or the copyright directive and filter, time and again, it has not been paranoid or conspiratorial to say that the people who work for us in government to collect evidence and sort the true from the false have, rather than doing that, been terminally compromised by inequality. And so you get a kind of breakdown. I call it the epistemological crisis. We no longer not only disagree on what's true, we disagree on how we know what's true. I mean, think of the anti-vaccine movement. It's not crazy to say that the pharma industry is concentrated, corrupt, and gets away with murdering its customers. Just look at Purdue Pharma, the company that introduced OxyContin. Purdue Pharma used a bogus medical study, a letter to JAMA by a doctor that wrote up 12 case studies as the evidence to push through widespread prescribing practices that ended up in the opioid epidemic that has now killed more Americans than were killed in Vietnam. So it's not foolish to say that the pharma companies are willing to pursue profit at the cost of human thriving. And it's also not foolish to say that the regulators let them get away with it, because they let them get away with it. After all, when your industry only has 4 or 5 companies, anyone qualified to regulate that industry probably works for one of those companies, probably worked for 3 of those companies, and is probably married to someone who worked for the other 2. So it is inarguable to say that pharma companies are corrupt and that regulators let them get away with it. So it's not an unreasonable thing to then conclude from that that vaccines are bad for you. Now, I think that's totally wrong. But, you know, if you were an opioid denier 10 years ago, you could have made the same arguments. You could have said, oh, well, the doctors and the medical establishment are saying we should prescribe tons of opioids as a matter of humane treatment of people suffering in pain. But I think that the industry is corrupt and the regulators are asleep at the switch, so I say I'm wrong. I say they're wrong. And you would have been right. So the same principles that are causing our neighbors to arrive at conclusions that are putting us all at risk, those principles are not wrong. People look to conspiracies to explain their world because so much of the bad stuff in our world turns out to be the result of conspiracies, right? SNC-Lavalin gets the highest officials in the Canadian government to try and give it a pass on corrupt practices. Exxon covers up its own knowledge of climate change and pays for expensive disinformation campaigns to muddy the waters. The NSA wiretaps the whole world's internet with the complicity of the big tech companies, and they lie like crazy about it. Now, these conspiracies don't come cheap. The authorities who help the conspirators, they expect handsome rewards. They're the kind of thing you can only pull off in a new Gilded Age, where policies have already been put in place to make the rich much, much richer. We won't make conspiracies implausible until we get rid of conspiracies. And we can't do that until we tackle wealth inequality. If we punish the platforms for their monopolistic abuses by imposing new duties on them that only the very largest companies can afford, duties to monitor and filter their users, we just make them the permanent overlords of the internet. We once dreamed of an internet that would be democratic, where we'd all get a say in its future. But if we invest the platforms with state-like roles in exchange for letting them grow so big that we can never depose them, we are ending the dream of democracy and replacing it with a constitutional monarchy where the kings rule forever by divine right, but a parliament of aristocrats puts some limits on their actions. And this is why it's so dangerous to say things like, even if you're not paying for the product, you're the product. After all, if you buy a $1,000 iPhone, Apple will use all of these policies to make sure that you only get your phone fixed by Apple at whatever price Apple wants to charge, and that they can end of life your phone when they decide that it's time for you to buy a new one. And then they'll also make sure that you can only buy your apps through their store, making sure that they get 30% of every dime you spend through every app. Right? They are selling you to their vendors, they are selling you to their service providers. Even if you pay for the product, you're still the product. And that's how it works in a monopoly. Google makes money by spying on you. Apple makes money by locking you in. Facebook makes money by spying on you and locking you in. Adding price tags to today's free services will not make them more democratic or accountable. It'll just make them more profitable. Indeed, conditioning access to culture and discourse by the ability to pay in a society riven by inequality is just a way to guarantee that dollars allow you to speak louder than everybody else. The only way to make big tech accountable is to make it smaller, break up the monopolies, ban the practice of using mergers and acquisitions for growth, crack down on vertical integration. It has been a hell of a year for our planet and the internet and our species. And we've got major challenges ahead of us: climate change, sexually motivated violence, white nationalism. I don't fight for the internet because it's more important than these things. The internet is not what I fight for, but it is what we're going to fight with. It's the terrain on which every one of those battles will be fought and won or lost. And if we lose the internet, we lose the fight before we start. We once dreamed of a democratic technology. We once taught kids STEM, not so they'd be prepared for the job market, but as technological self-defense, so that they could program rather than being programmed. A democratic, anti-oligarchic technological future is still possible if we seize the means of computation and use it to organize, to demand a future where we are neither spied upon nor locked in, a future where technology sets us free rather than putting us in chains. Thank you. Thank you. So we have 10 minutes for questions, is that right? Yes. I like to call alternately on people who identify as women or non-binary and people who identify as male or non-binary, especially in a male-heavy crowd like this. It tends to be kind of a sausage fest during the Q&A. But also, I should point out at this point that when you announce this, it's often the case that, speaking as a guy, the guys have been spending half the talk trying to think of a cool question that makes them sound smart, whereas the women have been actually listening. And so when you announce this, sometimes you have to vamp, as I'm doing right now, while someone who identifies as woman or non-binary in the audience thinks of a question. But maybe by now, someone who identifies as woman or non-binary in the audience can ask a question. Can we maybe bring the house lights up so I can see people? Is that possible? Or can you see? All right. Okay. Are there anyone want to ask a question? I know that was all pretty controversial, so I can see why there wouldn't be any questions. Yeah, in the back there. Thank you.
Hi, Cory.
Oh, hey.
Was
I think there was a woman in the back there, too. But go ahead. No, go ahead. Then we'll get the mic to her.
I just had a quick question
you're
about Edward Snowden. So you had kind of a picture of him earlier, and I was wondering if you think what Edward Snowden did was right or wrong, and what your take on that would be.
Yeah, I mean, my take is that what he did was right. I think that he took an oath to uphold the Constitution. I think he went through every whistleblower mechanism available to him and was brushed off or threatened. And I think that he did us all a service. I think that our governments did not create secret forms of law because they thought that we'd be pleasantly surprised and didn't want to spoil it. I think they did it because they knew that it was wrong and that it was unconstitutional and that it would not reflect the will of the people. I think that most of that, I think the whole surveillance program actually could have been statutorily approved if they thought that there was political will for it, without compromising the ability of the system to work, and they failed to do so. The fact that the Australians have now enacted some of that, and the fact that in the run-up to the 2015 election here, Justin Trudeau whipped the Liberals to vote for C-51, which enacts much of that as well, I think is disturbing, but it at least tells you that we had the conversation. And I'll note for the record that Trudeau said that he was only whipping the Liberals to vote for it because he said that they didn't want to be seen as soft and terror running up to the election, and that they would fix it after they got elected. He failed to do that in the same way that Obama, when he was a senator, voted and supported the idea of immunizing the phone companies for their complicity in mass surveillance and promised that he would fix it once he got into office, and again, never did. There was a woman in the back there. Could you put your hand up there, ma'am? Thank you.
Thank you. Really good talk. I actually follow EFF quite a bit, so I hear what you're saying. It's really needs to be said a lot more. But my question is, how do you feel? How do you not get overwhelmed by this and feel like, what can you do while still maintaining your job? I mean, that's one of the struggles I have. Is you want to get involved in these things, but at the same time, you're still somebody who has to, provide for your family. You have to. You don't want to be the person that's, particularly in a surveillance world, gets blacklisted by a lot of companies as, listen, this person's a little bit too out there.
Yeah.
What's your thought on that?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and I would add to it with as a friendly amendment, how do you not lose hope? Because that's a thing that I think a lot of us have been struggling with. This last year has been really hard. I have to say that I think that we lost 10 years ground in the last 12 months. And that we will be spending the next 10 years undoing the damage, for example, that 10 MEPs made by literally pressing the wrong button. To call it, like, face palming is a cute thing you do. I've been doing the non-cute version of face palming for a month now. I can't believe it. So I think that we are inclined, the reason these problems are overwhelming, same with climate change, same with all these other big systemic problems, is that for 40 years we've been framing them as individual problems, right? When you think about climate change, what's the most common message about climate change? If you go and look at like an article that'll be in the Sunday Weekend magazine or the Weekend Globe about climate change, it'll be like 10 things you can do around the office to help climate change. I'm here to tell you that unless your office is the office of the Minister of the Environment, there are 0 things you can do around the office to prevent climate change in any meaningful way. Like, you could be the world's most diligent recycler, and unless we can muster a collective will to do something about climate change, it won't matter, right? Our climate change problems are collective ones. Systematic underinvestment in public transit is why we have individual vehicles on our roads, and that's probably your biggest contribution to climate change right there. And you giving up your car won't make a subway appear, right? We need collective solutions to this. So Lawrence Lessig, who's a great thinker about technology and about political change, he talks about the world being regulated by 4 forces. He says that we're regulated by code, which is what's technologically possible, law, what's legally allowed, markets, what's profitable, and norms, what's socially acceptable, right? I think that there were a lot of us in the late 90s and early 2000s who thought of doing what Facebook does, right, is spying on everyone and mining it for actionable market intelligence, but we all thought that would be creepy, right? Normatively, we didn't do it, not because it was technologically impossible, but because it was normatively undesirable. And so norms affect what we do. Technology affects what we do. Things that are technologically impossible, you don't need laws against them, right? No one does them anyway. And once something is technologically possible, laws may not be very effective against them. I mean, one of the things that I think the Australians are going to find themselves contending with is that unless you block GitHub, people are going to download working cryptography. But it'll just be the bad guys and the paranoid people and not everyday people, which means that they'll all be at risk of having malicious firmware updates for their pacemakers, and bad guys will be safe. So code changes what's possible. Markets change what's possible. Once something has a business model, people do more of it, right? The reason that we're getting anti-circumvention code in car engines and tractors is not because manufacturers just like the sound of it. It's because they make more money when they do it. What's legally allowed changes what we do. I mean, this morning I landed at Pierre Trudeau Airport in Montreal, and as I went through immigration, I was delighted to see the sign that said, all cannabis products must be declared, right? What's legal changes what people do too, right? People now use marijuana as both a recreational and medical substance in a way that a lot of people didn't before it was legalized. I mean, there were people who opposed legalization because they said once it's legalized, more people will do it. They were right. I mean, now that it's legal, more people do it, right? So law, code, norms, and markets, they all interact with each other. And you can think of these as axes of freedom or axes of motion that you can traverse a complicated terrain under, right? In computer science, when we come up against a terrain that's too complex to enumerate, rather than trying to enumerate it, which may take so long that by the time we're done, we'll have run out of time to solve the problem or the terrain will have changed, we use heuristics. We use hill climbing to traverse these complex terrains, right? We pick a gradient that we want to ascend, right? We want to go towards some goal. And then we ask ourselves, from all the directions that our code can move in, for all the degrees of freedom that we have, which one takes us further up that gradient? And when we attain a new resting spot, we can from there look at what area of freedom are available to us. You know, the hill climbing, it analogizes to an insect with forward-facing eyes that can't see where the high ground is. The only way it can climb is by asking itself which leg is on the highest terrain. And it takes one step in that direction, and now it pulls its legs, and it takes one step in that direction. Well, the directions that our legs rest on are code, law, norms, and markets. When you find yourself confronted with a legal regime that is hopeless, ask yourself if there's a normative step that you can take to invalidate the legal regime. Think about the fights that we've had over things like gay marriage, which were mostly normative fights, right? There was some legal fights at the end, but mostly it was a combination of people having the privacy and self-determination to decide when they could tell the people that they loved that they were gay and recruit them as allies, and also big normative events like gay pride parades. Those normative things, they added up to a legal change. And so when you come up against the limit of what you can do legally, maybe there's a normative thing you can do. Or because of this audience, maybe it's a technical thing, right? Maybe you can contribute to CertBot to increase the level of encryption on the internet. CertBot's EFF's free and open source tool for using the free certificates from Let's Encrypt, thank you. I always hated that name, from Let's Encrypt. And so maybe you can grab one of the pull requests there and squash a bug. We have all these different areas of motion available to us, but the most important thing is that you have to see these as collective endeavors, right? Like you and I and no one we know, we're never going to fix this individually, but together we do, right? I helped write a treaty called the Access to Information Treaty that then became the Treaty of Marrakesh, which safeguards the rights of people who are blind and have other disabilities to access copyrighted works in assistive formats. And when we convened the first Access to Information Treaty meeting, it was at the Médecins Sans Frontières offices in Geneva. And the guy who convened it was a guy named Jamie Love, who runs a nonprofit called Knowledge Ecology International. And someone in the middle of this exercise, it was like 7 a.m. on a Sunday, we were all sitting around talking about this stuff. They said to Jamie, like, what makes you think we can do this? This is ridiculous. And he said, the World Trade Organization TRIPS agreement, the thing that makes the copyright agreement in the WTO, that makes this even necessary, was written by people no smarter than you in a room less than a mile from where we're sitting, right? And if they can do it, we can do it, right? It is our collective endeavor that makes the change. There was no one heroic champion who made that happen. And there will be no one heroic champion that fixes it. It will be our collective effort that makes the difference. And if we have a 10-year challenge ahead of us to figure out how we're going to resolve this last year, then that's the 10-year challenge we're going to have to take, because abandoning the internet is not an option, right? If we abandon the internet, the people who want to use it to do horrible things won't say, well, I guess we should abandon it too, right? The internet just loses its defenders and becomes worse and worse and worse. So we don't have a choice. We have to fight for it. Thank you. I think that's time. Thank you very much.